Hey guys, my name is Dylan from Global Jaya School, and in this video I'll be showing you guys how I make terrariums and how they can act as mini ecosystems. So the first step after you've prepared your enclosure is to apply a background. This step is something that's optional. I just use it to make it look more aesthetic. The background which I am using is an artificial background made out of styrofoam. You could also use things such as wood barks or other natural materials too. The next step is to pour gravel at the very bottom layer of the terrarium. You could also use other materials such as clay balls, pebbles, or small pieces of stone. This will act as a drainage system to avoid making the substrate that will be the ground floor of the terrarium too wet. Because if the substrate gets too wet, it won't be good for the plants because there's too much water content, and the minerals and vitamins of the substrate will also disappear, which is something that is needed in order for the plants in the terrariums to grow. Next, we put in the nylon mesh on top of the gravel layer, which will act as a filter to separate the substrate and the drainage system. You could also use a wire mesh, but that will rust over time and could be bad for the living creatures in the terrarium. Make sure the mesh isn't too big or too small. After that, we can pour in the substrate. For my substrate, I'll be using a mix of cocoa fiber, sphagnum moss, and a mix of dried sticks and leaves. Make sure you mix it well. The reason why I chose these materials for my substrate is that, first of all, the sphagnum moss will help it retain moisture, dried sticks and leaves will decompose over time, making the soil more rich, and the cocoa fiber is able to give the floor a more natural dirt look. And of course, you could also use other materials such as small stones, dirt, etc. The substrate is basically used for the plants to grow, because without this, they probably wouldn't live, because this is their main source of food and minerals. After mixing the substrate and spreading it out equally, we can start to put in the pieces of wood for hiding spots for the animals which will be housed in the terrarium, and can also be for the plants to grow on. The wood pieces that I will be using is specifically from a tree called terrarium. After that, we can start adding plants into the terrarium. The plants will help bring more life into it and making it look more natural. The plants in the terrarium will also release water vapor, in other words, recycling the water, which the vapor will then be collected in the walls and which then will drip down onto the substrate, making it somewhat self-nourishing. But since my terrarium isn't fully sealed, I still need to maintain its humidity by watering them. The different plant species that I am putting inside my terrarium are species which need a fair amount of humidity in order to live. Before putting the plants in the terrarium, make sure you do your research to make sure that the plants aren't poisonous and they won't harm the animals which will be housed in the terrarium with them. Some of the plants which I housed in the terrarium itself will go together with their pots, because sometimes if plants are removed from a place which they have been growing for a long time, they can experience a lot of stress which eventually can lead the plant to die. Next, I will be adding more substrate to cover up the plant's pots and roots and make sure the ground level is a bit higher, because it still seems a bit too shallow for the plants to grow roots in. Then I'm going to be adding more wood pieces, but in this time the wood pieces I'm using are unknown because these wood pieces were scavenged from the forest. But I made sure that they were all clean and sanitized. The reason I added these wood pieces later on in the process of making the terrarium is to see if there will be any spots that can be covered to avoid making it look empty or too blank. After adding the wood pieces, I'm going to be adding some mossy wood pieces. Over time, the moss will eventually grow and spread around the enclosure itself, making the enclosure look more aesthetic and forest-like. Then I'm going to be adding more substrate to fill in the blank spaces between the woods, making sure they are filled up and there won't be any empty spaces on the bottom floor of the terrarium. Unlike the cocoa fiber before, this cocoa fiber is very fine and smooth, which will give the ground a different texture. After you're done decorating the terrarium, you can then water the substrate and the plants, making it wet and humid. Make sure you spray this daily, every day or every few days to maintain its humidity, unless you have an automatic watering system. We're almost done. Now we're gonna start housing in the living things. So first up, we have springtails. They're a very small white colored organism which will eat all the nasty stuff such as feces, fungi, leftover food, etc. After adding in the springtails, I'll also be adding another microorganism called the isopod. They have a very similar role to the springtails as decomposers to make sure the terrarium is clean, eating all the nasty stuff, etc. After that, I'm also gonna be adding some cockroaches. This isn't like the normal cockroaches you see running around the house. They're called dubia roaches, scientifically known as Bleptica dubia. They are here as the food source of the apex predator of the terrarium, which will be my giant day geckos. And finally, I'm gonna be housing in my giant Madagascar day geckos, scientifically known as Phasuma grandis. These geckos are native to the eastern coast of Madagascar. Their diet varies from different types of insects and fruit. The reason I'm moving them into the terrarium is because I've been keeping these guys for a few years and I think they deserve an upgrade. So back to the topic about ecosystems. The natural ecosystem is an important part of the world which all humans and living creatures need in order to live. Terrariums can act as mini ecosystems as long as they have the factors of which an ecosystem has, such as the food chain, niches, etc. And in this case, in the terrarium, the gecko is the predator, food source is the roaches, and decomposers include the springtails and isopods. That's like already one cycle, how they have their different roles in the terrarium. And according to a plant expert which I interviewed for my research, is that if a terrarium has the aspects of which a natural ecosystem has, such as sun, rain, dirt, vitamins, minerals, etc., it is fit to be called an ecosystem, which all these aspects are fulfilled by the terrarium which I made, such as the dirt, cocoa fiber sticks, the lizard's droppings can also act as fertilizer, making the plant soil more richer. The sun is replaced with the UVB light, which has the same effect as the sun, allowing the geckos to absorb the vitamin D3 and also allowing the plants to photosynthesize. And the rain is made possible by misting or using an automatic watering system. Besides its role of being a mini ecosystem, making terrariums is also good in the animal keeping hobby, because instead of keeping it in a normal small or plain enclosure, it's better to keep it in terrarium sometimes. But then, depending on what type of animal you're keeping in the terrarium, you should make it fit to their natural environment, such as the desert, tropical rainforest, etc. And that's it for my video. Thank you for listening, and I hope you guys learned some new things about building terrariums and how they can represent a natural ecosystem.